Alright, you all saw the title, but for once, the title isn't actually self-explanatory. So today I'll be outlining whether or not a story is date-dependent versus being dated. A date-dependent story relies on aspects of whatever time period it's set in order to work. The story or plot of these movies requires the time period it's in order for them to work or make any sense at all. The movie Home Alone is a date-dependent story. If you set that same story in today's day and age, say in the 2020s, then the story wouldn't make any sense because there's absolutely no reason that child wouldn't have a cell phone. I'm sorry, but most children, especially ones living in a house that big and nice that can afford that many people living in it, would have some kind of cell phone for him. He would have a cell phone, he would have internet access, he would have a computer, he would have a social media profile, he would absolutely have a way to contact his family and his family to contact him. The entire story would thusly not happen because it would have been prevented before it could. There's also the series Death Note, and while there's plenty of reasons why it tanked in the Netflix adaptation, one of the chief mistakes that they made was trying to bring it to the modern age instead of keeping it back in time where it was originally. Back in time when the internet was still relatively young, it is entirely believable that someone could have snuck around online back then. But with modern day super sleuths going around and the massive communities on the internet, there is no way Kira would have been able to use the internet without being caught just so quickly. Some private Discord group, some 4chan thread, some Reddit thread would have been able to find him relatively quickly, especially given the fact that he was making a lot of noise. Modern day investigative techniques would have made his crimes almost impossible to commit and get away with the amount of notoriety that he insisted on drawing to himself. This was not the only problem with that series, but it is one that I took note of. The internet has used the positioning and movement of the stars and sun in the sky in order to find the location of streaming cameras pointed upwards. The whole story and massive swaths of the plot would have to be rewritten in order for him to maintain his persona while operating exclusively under public eye. But that's why these pieces actually rely on the timeline that they're in, and it made no sense why they decided to push it forward, other than the fact that they were trying to cheaply get you to identify with the new characters by making their world similar to what their target audience might recognize, rather than actually writing the characters compelling enough to draw you in the first place. I moved forward with the times and therefore don't have many fond memories or identifiable thoughts about the time of flip phones, but I was still perfectly capable of understanding and relating to the characters in Death Note. And that brings us to a story that is dated. Now this is very different because it's not dependent on a date, but rather is predicated on assumptions or beliefs that are now known to be untrue, unfeasible, or just not how the society will work. Simpler ones are usually scientific, like there used to be an old myth that your eye would capture an image of the last thing you saw before you died. To the surprise of healing crystal and snake oil users alike, this wasn't feasibly applicable in any form. This did not change the fact that some stories did in fact use that, or perhaps the you only use 10% of your brain. This is an obvious lie, but has been continually used in media even though it makes no sense. And frankly, it's downright scary the amount of people who believe that 90% of your brain is unused. Here's a fun fact: if you remove even 10% of your brain, depending on how you distribute it and what you remove, you could suffer potentially serious setbacks, up to and including loss of motor control, loss of memory, loss of emotional range, and the loss of connection to the server of life. Yet for some reason we still made the movie Lucy, a movie I simply could not take seriously throughout the entire thing because immediately upon hearing someone reference that she was using, I think it was 50% of her brain, I had a mental image of her lying on the ground flopping around drooling into the carpet, because 50% of your brain is not much to work with. But a better vision of a dated movie would probably be Ready Player One. I get that it was based on a book and they wanted to stay true to the book, but the book itself was dated. The idea of what the internet would become or how people would react in those situations was just so unbelievably off based on what we know about networking now. Someone would have absolutely figured out the trick to the first race. Hell, there's gotta be at least some people who are massive trolls who would have just slammed on the reverse key just to fuck with the people behind them. Or maybe even just because. But it moves on from there. There's no way that you would have people who aren't data mining the game. The idea that people would ever be okay with a game where you lose everything upon death, and that could represent a significant portion of your current real-world investment investment. Also, there was a strange lack of fetishization there. There would be a lot more anime characters and a lot more furries. There would be people walking around in BDSM wear. Why do I know that? Because when people feel like they could dress up however the hell they want, a shocking amount of people would dress up in sexy clothing or BDSM wear. I've been to... There are girls literally dressed in paint and underwear. That's not an exaggeration. They came dressed as a witch from Left 4 Dead. It's certainly an interesting perspective on what we thought the internet was going to be way back then, but functionally speaking, we have since moved well beyond that to the point of understanding that that's simply not how it would turn out. And the world becomes unbelievable. The characters become unrelatable. And you all remember that optography reference that I made earlier and how people from modern days would not get that reference? Ready Player One is 100% reference. They have piled so many bits of nostalgia and reference to other media into this media that it almost doesn't have much of its own. In a single action scene, you could see 30 different characters you'd recognize, even if you didn't do geekdom stuff. They plastered nostalgia all over that movie to try and relate to you. And the problem with using nostalgia as the key draw to your movie is that A, it's a really cheap way for you to get people's attention, and B, what people are nostalgic over is going to change relatively quickly. Though I will give them credit for diversifying the nostalgia by including literally anything that anyone could have ever been nostalgic about. And to be honest, we're rapidly heading towards a oppressed AI story being put to the test, because we are getting closer to AI. Once we put that to the test, whether we confirm what we believed would happen back then, or if we move in another direction, will determine whether or not those will come across as dated ideas when we look back on them. There are people who hold conversations with their Roombas, who put googly's eyes on them. People get emotionally attached to Vocaloids and their Pokemon. It's getting harder and harder to believe that people would not consider AI sapient once they become sapient. There's probably at least one person who put googly eyes on their oven and named it Kevin because it's always bacon. So remember, if you're telling a story or reading a story, that not all of the societal commentary will stand the test of time, and sometimes the date that it is set in is incredibly important as to whether or not it makes any sense. So if I ever use the term date dependent, it means I'm talking about whether or not it needed to be set in that date. Or more accurately, should it have had its date changed for some reason along the lines of production, whether or not that was a good or a bad decision. And when I say something is dated, what I'm saying is that the perspective or assumptions it makes about the world, society, or something similar have since been shown to be untrue, or is at least no longer relatable. And while this isn't necessarily the fault of the media, this does make it harder for any modern audience to enjoy it as much. But if I can get actual comments on this, then I'd actually like to know, what is a dated movie that you still enjoy, and what is a date dependent movie that you think came out really well for the day it was based around? Usually that's probably going to be gangster movies, because modern day gangsters would not work at all the same as the old school gangsters did. The world has changed too much for that to be functional anymore. And because I love to hear about some exceptions to the rules, I'd also like to hear about what your favorite movies might be that were based upon a story date dependent, but managed to change it so much that it started to work in the new setting. Pocahontas, for example. Pocahontas wouldn't really work all that well currently in today's setting. It is date dependent. However, if you go well beyond the date we're currently at and introduce an entire new society for us to interact with, all of a sudden the Pocahontas storyline starts to work. You just have to shuffle the names around. And what's a dated movie that, despite having been disproven in today's day and age, you feel properly set up enough of an alternate history that its outcome is still feasible inside of the world? Be sure to like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, and all those other things that the algorithm likes slightly more than VTubers. Or if you didn't like any of the comment prompts that I provided to you and you're a Ready Player One fan that refuses to accept that the story is dated, I ask only that you be entertainingly angry.